Hi, this is Miss DeVito. Today I'm going to show you how to make one of my family favorite recipes, raspberry pecan bars. For today's recipe, we are going to use a stand mixer. We're going to use the paddle attachment, which is good for both the creaming method and the straight dough mixing method. Our large bowl has rivets on the bottom that help attach it to the stand and lock in place. The motor head goes up and down, and there is a lever, a lock lever on the side that is important to use so that the motor head does not go up and down when the speed is high. On the side is the speed for stirring. Always start off at a low speed and then increase as you begin to mix so that you do not make a mess. When you're putting the bowl on, you always have to make sure that you lock it into place and test it to make sure that it is in place. When you're adding the paddle attachment, make sure that you are inserting it correctly so that it will also lock into place. For this recipe, you need 365 grams of all-purpose flour, 215 grams of sugar, 1 egg, 120 grams of chopped pecans or any nut, 215 grams of sugar, 3/4 of a cup of raspberry preserves or any other preserves or jellies that you can find or prefer. We're going to use an 8-inch square pan with a piece of parchment paper that hangs over the sides. Now to mix our recipe. We're going to use this straight dough mixing method, and in this method you really just put all of your ingredients together in the mixer. I like to start off with the dry ingredients first and combine them well so that they are evenly distributed. So I've added the flour, the sugar, and I'm going to mix them just to combine them. I'm then going to add my softened butter. This butter has been left out at room temperature for a few hours so that it is soft and easy to handle. I'm going to whip up my 1 egg just to break it down a little bit, and then I'm going to add it right to my recipe. I'm also going to add my pecans in. Again, I can use any chopped nuts, walnuts, almonds, pecans, cashews, peanuts, whatever you prefer. I'm going to close the motor head, I'm going to lock it in place, and I'm going to start to stir this mixture on low. If you start it off too high, what's going to happen is that all of the flour is going to fly all over. We're going to go nice and slow because we don't want to make this into a paste. We are looking for a crumbly texture. I'm going to turn off the mixer, unlock the lever, and then I'm just going to make sure that I take any excess dough off of the mixer blade, put the motor head back down, lock it in place, and then start again. The whole mixing process probably takes about 3 minutes. You could do this by hand very easily, but we wanted to show you how to use a mixer for some of your recipes. Now you can see that I have a really nice crumbly texture. I'm going to turn off the mixer. I'm going to check its consistency. Okay, so when I press it together, it actually should hold, but we are looking for some loose crumbs, so I'm going to be very gentle as I comb through this dough mixture. Just a couple of more spins to make sure it's nice and loose. And now I'm going to start to portion. I have a pan, an 8-inch pan that I'm going to spray with a little bit of pan spray so I can make sure that the parchment paper stays in place and the sides gives it a little bit of coating so that the cookie bar doesn't stick. I put a piece of parchment paper in, and I make sure that it's larger than the actual pan so that it hangs up the side, so it's easy for me to use those tabs to remove the cookie bar from the pan when it's done cooking. I'm going to take my bowl off. I'm going to reserve 2 cups of crumb mixture on the side. This is for the topping. Just making sure that when I scoop in there, I'm making sure that it's still loose crumb and I'm not packing it down too tight. The remaining mixture is going to go on the bottom of the pan. If you wanted a thinner cookie bar, you can use an 8 by 10 pan, a rectangular pan. I wanted a thicker cookie bar, so I used a square pan. So I place all of the crumbs on the bottom, and now I'm going to pack them in really tight. This is going to help ensure for even baking, and it's also going to help it stay together when I cut them. Making sure that the layers are as even as I can so that I ensure for even baking. Now I need 3/4 of a cup of raspberry preserves. You can use any type of jam or jelly that you would like. Strawberry, raspberry, orange, apricot. All of the flavors would be very delicious in this recipe. If you like more jelly, you can add more jelly, but we find that 3/4 of a cup is adequate amount. Now I'm going to spread out this preserves evenly all the way to the edges. Again, if you want to add more jelly, you can, but for us, we only like to add 3/4 of a cup. If you're going to make a rectangle, you probably add about 1 cup instead of 3/4 of a cup. Now I'm going to take the remaining crumbs and I'm going to sprinkle them all over the top, making sure that you get into the corner some of the crumb toppings because that's where the jelly seems to burn a little bit more. So you want to make sure that you're able to not have any empty spaces. And now I'm ready to bake. I preheated my oven to 350 degrees and I'm going to cook them for 40 minutes at 350 degrees, rotating them halfway through the baking process. If the top is getting too browned, lower it to the bottom shelf. After 40 minutes, check for doneness. You will see that the sides, the jelly is bubbling a little bit. You will also see the top is a nice golden brown. Please let this cool before taking it out of the pan and cutting into portions. I'm going to use a knife or a bench scraper to help loosen the sides of the pan. If it's still a little bit warm, it may come out a little bit more easily. Be careful, just making sure not to cut the cookie, just sliding the knife along the edges. Using the parchment paper that hangs over, it's easy for me to take it right out of the pan. I'm going to take the parchment paper off of the bottom. I'm actually going to use that parchment paper as a guide for me when I'm cutting these raspberry bars into equal servings. I'm going to take that parchment paper and I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise, and then I'm going to fold it again in half one more time so that I fold the paper into quarters. And I'm going to use this as a guide because this should be the width of all of my pieces. I'm going to score the top of the raspberry bars so I can know exactly where my first cuts are going to go. I'm going to go down the column and then across the rows. You could put a score mark all the way across the whole raspberry bar if that's what you prefer. After you mark it, you're going to go back and you're going to cut all the way through gently. Notice how I use the tip of the knife first and push down with my guiding hand, so I make sure that all my fingers are out of the way. After I cut my first portions, I can go and I can cut them into squares. You could eyeball the lines if you wanted to, but it is best to kind of pre-measure them so that they look a little bit more even. I'm actually going to trim the sides because there's a little bit of a burnt piece of the jelly on it. You can do that if you want. That's not totally necessary to do. From this recipe, I made 16 raspberry bars. Now I'm going to plate them. So you're going to put them on your serving platter, and we want to be able to top them with a little something to add a little bit of appeal to the dish. So I'm going to top it with some powdered sugar. I take a fine mesh strainer and I put a little bit of the powdered sugar into the strainer gently. And then I use my hand to tap the side of the strainer so that I can get the sugar evenly distributed over the top of the raspberry bars. I'm going to put my second layer on top, and I'm going to repeat the same process. You can put as much or as little sugar as you care to. This only works best with powdered sugar. I hope you enjoyed my raspberry bar recipe. Let me know if you try them at home.